Today on the AllMomDoes podcast, I'm Julie Lyles Carr, and I'm welcoming today Eric Jacobsen. There is a topic that I just feel that bubbles up so often when I talk with women about where they're at in their worlds and what's going on. Of course, we always have to talk about the feeling of overwhelm and how to balance all the things in our lives. But one thing that I do hear resonate at times, even if someone has a hard time putting voice to it, is the idea of loneliness. The loneliness that a lot of people feel, whether that is moms with little bitty kids and she feels kind of trapped in the house, all the way to a woman who her kids have moved on and she's trying to really craft a new season. Loneliness seems to be a common theme. So Eric, thank you so much for being with us today. I know you have such profound wisdom about loneliness, but give us a little information about yourself, where you live, your life, all the things.
So I'm a pastor in Tacoma, Washington, which is just south of Seattle. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Northwest, I married, got 4 kids myself, and they're all, well, one's still at home. The rest of them are somewhat launched in college and graduate school and whatnot. So yeah, 4 dogs. Actually.
Okay, 4 dogs. Very impressive.
And chickens.
Chickens. Now, see, now I just feel like a less than. I've just got 2 cats and a dog. So I just, I feel like when you start moving into livestock, then you really understand how domesticated somebody is. That's very impressive.
Yeah, I'm not super involved with the chickens though. That's
okay.
And the kids. So
we won't hold it against you. I love it. So in your work in pastoring, do you find that people often, even if they have a troubling time identifying it, do you find that sometimes at the core of what people are wrestling with is loneliness? And how do you begin to identify when you're with someone that loneliness is really the core issue of what's going on?
Yeah, I think it's just everywhere. I mean, I think our lives have gotten super busy, and I think our lives have gotten fragmented where we've got sort of a little bit of community in our workplace, or we have a little bit of community in some of our kids' activities. We have a little bit of community through our church and some of our regular routines, and it's all spread out. And so I think people don't have the kind of continuity of relationships that they've had at other points in their lives. A lot of people look back to like their college days as these really fulfilling times where they would see the same people multiple times throughout the day, and they'd really enjoy interactions. But now it feels like, even our good friends, we only see sometimes every couple of months because it's really hard to get our schedules aligned and just setting all that up. So yeah, almost everybody I talk to is dealing with, I don't know if they always use the word lonely, but I think there's kind of a longing for more relational connection. And I think it's probably broader than just relationships. Loneliness is what everyone's talking about right now, but I think it's sort of a lack of belonging, a sense of not only disconnection from the friendships we wish we had, but also a disconnection from the place that we live, and just kind of that old sense of like just walking around and being known by the community.
Right,
I think there's a longing for that.
I definitely had that longing. I wouldn't have identified it as understanding that's what it was, but for a very long time, we moved around a lot when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. And when my husband and I were expecting our first child, we moved back to the town that he had been raised in since he was a 6-week-old. And his parents were both principals at elementary schools in that community. And the magic, Eric, that it felt when I would go into a grocery store and someone would know me or would know Michael. And it was just this sense of, oh, I have a place now, which was not really something I had experienced due to the moves that I had gone through as a kid. Now, in this,
can I just key in on that? Because I think that's actually kind of an interesting story that ties it. So what you experience in the grocery store is a piece of the puzzle, which I think sometimes gets left out. I call it kind of civic belonging. So it's different from like your small group at your house or your family or your husband. These are all important too. You need that, But what you'd experience at the grocery store at your husband's place, where you're known by the community, you don't know that checker super well, but the fact that they know your husband's name and have sort of seen him grow up and whatnot, I don't know. I feel like that's something that's really missing, and we don't think about it. Like I think the church, for instance, really, let's get small groups going, let's do marriage seminars, and all that stuff's really great. But the church doesn't have a lot of on their radar kind of how do we help people connect to the places they live in that civic sense. And I have a similar. I've only lived here 13 years now, but my church is just about half a mile from my home. I ride my bike or I walk. But if I were to walk home right now, I would be greeted by name by at least 12 people store owners and people walking in the neighborhood. They don't know me super well, but that really makes me feel like I belong to this community.
Right. I love that phrase, civic belonging. I had never thought of it that way. And it really is a profound thing because every time we moved, we did the things that you're supposed to do. We always found a church home, and my brothers and I went to public school, and we got very involved in the schools, and, we were good neighbors. We did all those things. But you're right. The piece that often was missing was that sense of civic belonging. I love how you distinguish that. One of the things that I think is interesting, I've been in ministry for many years now as well. And I have to say, prior to the pandemic, I was around a ton of people all the time, recognized all the time, and still have grappled with feelings of loneliness, even though I'm saturated in people. Sometimes to the place where I'm like, I cannot people anymore. So, Eric, what's that about? When it's not that you're isolated, you're out there, but there's still a sense of where do I fit and why do I sometimes feel lonely?
Yeah, that's a fairly common experience for a lot of people, is to be around people and still feeling lonely. And I think that can have a variety of reasons for why that's happening. But in some cases, the kind of connection that we long for is different from what we're experiencing. Being with people who really know us, know our story, and we can be ourselves with, as opposed to people that we feel like we have to perform in a certain way or they're expecting something from us. And so being aware of the quality of the community connections that we're desiring can be part of it. I mean, part of it too can be where you stand on the introvert extrovert kind of thing. Like sometimes, we really long for human connection, but we have, for introverts, I don't know where you stand on that spectrum, but for introverts, it's a mixed blessing to be with people. It does drain some of your energy. And so you have to make sure that there's time to be alone and to be in solitude. But I think solitude is actually quite wonderful. That's kind of the chosen isolation. But loneliness is where you really want to be with people, but there aren't people to be with. And so I think part of what happens when especially in ministry, when you're surrounded by people, but they may not be the kind of people that we can really let our hair down with and who really know us well enough that it feels like we've made the kind of connection that we want.
Right. And I think, depending on someone's given profession or how well they're known in a certain community or whatever, that ability to truly be as real as you need to be, that your soul sometimes needs to be able to say, here's all the things. You're right. I think that can be a very isolating moment in terms of knowing who you can be real with.
The other thing I just thought of, and back to those civic relationships, is one of the things that I think people experience, I think particularly women in this way, is a lot of our relationships are tied to obligations. We've got relationships with our kids and our husbands and other people there, and they're wonderful in some ways, but they also, we have to do something to maintain the integrity of those relationships. And that can be part of the exhaustion of daily living, is these pile of to-do lists and whatnot. And one of the things that's kind of nice about these civic friendships that I'm talking about, that civic belonging, is even though the checker at the store, they don't know you super well. I mean, that's not the intimate kind of belonging that you want, but they don't make a lot of demands on you, and you can just sort of enjoy chit chat with them. There's something satisfying about that. Just having a cat. They don't know me as their pastor. They don't know me as somebody that needs something, but I can just talk to them about random stuff. And I don't know, it feels, it's a light kind of relationship. Again, it's not everything we need, but it's a piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. And I do find, and I'm going to refer back to like Hallmark Christmas movies, this idea of civic belonging. It's something that I see over and over again that speaks to a felt need of people, because what do you always find in some of these movies that show just this longing for Christmas and home and that kind of thing is that person who can walk through the town square and everybody's like, hey, so-and-so. And there is that place where it's just light and it's not an agenda full kind of experience. There is really something of value, I think, in that, to have that, hey, how you doing, with the checker at the grocery store. I love that. Now, you have a beautiful metaphor for taking a look at the things that often contribute to a place of loneliness or of not feeling a sense of belonging. Unpack for me this concept you have about 3 pieces of glass, how these three pieces of glass oftentimes get in the way of the connections that we really long for.
I'll start with the third, because that's the one that's probably most obvious to people. Obviously, the smartphone has really changed the way we interact with people, right? And I think most people are somewhat aware of it's a mixed blessing. So many things we can do with our phones. We wouldn't want to do without them for very long. However, when you're at the grocery store line, or if you're waiting to pick up your kids from school, and you look around and see that everybody's staring down at the screen and ignoring the human people that are like within 5 feet of them, you feel like, something's not right about this. We're choosing interesting cat videos or something over the actual person in our proximity. And so people are aware of that. But what I try to do with these 3 pieces of glass, I try to trace that back a little bit into some other sort of societal wide decisions in which we chose less face-to-face human interactions for something else. And the first one, which is somewhat surprising to a lot of people, is the automobile, which has a windshield, right? That's your first piece of glass. And simple observation is sometimes we treat people differently, or often we treat people differently when we encounter them driver to driver. Really nice people sometimes say really unkind things or make unkind gestures to other people when they encounter them as drivers. And my premise there is that when we encounter people driver to driver, we don't see another human being usually behind the other wheel. They're a competitor for lane space, for parking space, and they're a danger to us. If they're irresponsible with drinking or sleepy in driving, they could actually kill us or kill our loved ones. And so they're a threat to us. And so we treat them differently. And so we act differently when we pass each other face to face on the sidewalk than we do driving next to each other. We made a decision for a lot of reasons to make driving kind of the main way we're going to get around for a lot of good reasons. But what we maybe didn't account for is how that would impact our civic relationships with one another, kind of lose opportunities to interact in that way. With that change came to a little bit of how we change our home design. We have a garage in front. Our home's kind of turned towards the backyard instead of towards the front. So we used to have a front porch where you'd sit on the front porch in the evening and neighbors would walk by and they'd interact in that way. But now, because the car and a lot of other reasons, we designed our homes in that other way. We're not sitting on our front porch any longer. There's no more neighborhood stroll talking with neighbors. And so my premise is we got a little bit lonely in that, or we sort of missed the neighbor interaction, and the TV came in as a second piece of glass to fill that gap. And so now we have these really interesting interactions with TV characters and reality show characters, and they're way more interesting in some ways than our neighbors. But they're not real relationships, right? They don't demand anything of us. And so we kind of almost have a voyeuristic, we get really worked up in our emotions, and we get, we're sad and we're happy, we're cheering for Team Edward or whatever, we kind of get into that thing, but we're not really having a relationship with them. And so once again, we're spending a lot of our time, instead of having real human relationships, having these screen mediated. So we've designed a world in which you can wake up in the morning, have a cup of coffee and watch your morning show, go right through your house to your garage, drive in your car completely sealed by glass, park in the basement of an office building, take the elevator up, work in a cubicle, and return all day. And you haven't really had any face-to-face civic interactions. You might have seen a family member or a coworker, but you haven't had any interaction with other people outside of your home. And then the idea is, well, there's a couple breaks in that system, right? You might have to go pick up your kids from school. You might have to go to the grocery store to get groceries. But now we've got this third piece of glass that we take with us that sort of protects us from actual human relationships in that setting. And the third piece of glass, unfortunately, brings out the worst side of both the car and the TV. We both are really mean to each other on our smartphones sometimes. Right. You can say there's no, we're just as mean in our smartphones as we are sometimes driving our cars.
Yes.
We're also kind of voyeuristic. We get really caught up in like a human interest story or a cute cat video or whatnot. It's really pulling on our emotions, but we have no actual connection with that person or that cat, for instance. And so we're using up a lot of our empathy on these things rather than asking the other parent at the pickup, hey, how's it going today? I mean, some parents are really good at doing that. I don't want to paint too broad of a brush, but there's just this kind of tendency to avoid opportunities for human face-to-face interaction.
Right. And, at the time that we are having this interview, Eric, we're in the midst still. I mean, people are beginning to come out. We're going into different stages and phases of having been in lockdown. But it's interesting because there's another piece of glass, which is sort of the only way people have been able to interact a little bit in this particular time period, which is through video conferencing, those kinds of things, through their computers. So what do you think we're going to see on the flip side as things begin to open back up? I think you're so onto it that what people have probably really missed in this time, at least the people that in my world, they're missing big gatherings. They like the energy of the event. They like all that kind of thing. But I think what they've also been missing that they haven't necessarily been able to put voice to, they'll say, I just miss people. And, in my particular home, we have been on lockdown with 9 people. I'm really not missing people, to be frank, Eric. We're good on people. I am an ambivert. So that's where I land on that scale between introvert and extrovert. But I am finding it interesting that people are I think what they're really missing is what you're describing, which is that civic interaction. In my particular neighborhood, it's a very active neighborhood. People are exercising a lot. There's a lot of guilt that goes flying by my front windows, Eric. It's people like living their best lives, exercising and all that kind of stuff.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
I know. It's a little bit, condemning, but we do have a neighborhood that is very friendly. And I will say for the most part, but I've seen even more people out sitting on their front porches, calling out to one another, chatting from a distance, more than I've ever seen. And so I think it undergirds this notion that we do long for that civic experience, that civic contact. What do you see, having done such a deep dive into this topic, what are you noticing during the process of the lockdown, and who do you think will be on the other side? Who do you think we're going to come out the other side to? What are we going to value, and how is that going to be expressed?
So a couple of things. I think there's fun ironies in these. I'm talking about the problems of screen-mediated communication, right as that's the only way we communicate with anyone.
Right.
So I've transitioned my church to live stream, and I'm during the greeting time, I'm telling people to take their phones out and text somebody, in the church and say hello and all that. One of the things we've learned during the pandemic is we can do a lot more with screens than maybe we thought possible. And that's not a bad thing. I think, we've got shut-ins in our church that are now, once this pandemic is over, we're going to be do a lot better job keeping them connected to the church body because we've done some of these upgrades to our screen abilities. That said, I think this is also making us realize how much we really just long the human connection. These Zoom calls are effective. We've transitioned all of our church meetings, and we've done family birthday parties on Zoom and all these kinds of things. And those things work okay, but it's also kind of making it really obvious that it's not ultimately what we really want. We really want to be in each other's presence. So, I've never been anti-technology. I use my phone all the time, and I've made a lot of friends through the internet, people who are interested in the same thing. But I always think technology, for me at least, needs to land in a face-to-face human connection. It's always my goal that eventually this person that I met, in one way or another, in a non-face-to-face way, eventually we're going to have coffee together or a beer together, and we're going to be able to kind of have, some kind of connection. Hopefully we're going to all remember how much we need face-to-face contact. And I think the third thing, kind of as you were suggesting with your neighborhood, is I think it's made us more aware of the value of our proximate relationships, because the lockdown has kind of kept us homebound to some extent. We canceled a big trip this summer. We for a while, we couldn't drive very far, weren't supposed to drive very far. The main thing we could do to get out of our house is go for a walk. And the main people we saw when we went for a walk was our neighbors. Right. And so we ended up talking. We know our immediate neighbors pretty well, but then the neighbors 2 blocks down, we got talking to and whatnot. And I do think that it's sort of forced us all to think about who are our neighbors. Part of the other side of these glass things that I'm saying are part of a problem is they really opened up our world. We can have relationships with people across the globe pretty easily. We can constantly connect with people who aren't in proximate distance from where we are. But I think there's something special about the people who live within a mile of where we live, or from, within our church as well.
Right. Now, talk to me about something that I feel like I've been noticing in the ministry space, and I'm trying to figure out exactly what we do about it. I find that sometimes people will tell me how lonely they feel, how longing they are for connection, how longing they are for a sense of belonging. And yet, gotta be honest, Eric, their friendship skills have never been honed. So they walk into this space feeling lonely. And a lot of times as church leaders, we're encouraging people, we want you to feel like you belong. We want you to be here, all those things. But they lead out so deeply with their needs. And a lot of those needs are legitimate. A lot of those needs come from a really deep story or a place of hurt. But they're wearing out the people around them, which then has the ironic effect of isolating them even more, making them even lonelier, because people see them coming from a mile off. And it's like, I don't have the energy to try to deal with this person today. So what are some of the skills that we need to do a good self-check on to make sure that we're not actually part of the issue when it comes to feeling lonely?
Yeah, that's a great insight. And unfortunately, I don't have the answer. It's not in my book. So readers, I wish I could say, yes, but on page 322,
on page 322, I do it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a real issue. And I think there's things we can do within the church community to help I think what's interesting is because so many of these skills of interaction have, I would say, kind of eroded over the last 50 years as we've sort of prioritized other ways of communicating. We've become a little more uncivil with each other. You've described really well one sort of relational problem that people bring to the context. Well, there's a lot of them out there. And so I think at one level, we need to do a better job teaching within the church. We have to teach things like hospitality. We need to teach things like how to have people over for dinner, how to have a friendship. Sometimes these things, it's almost embarrassing how simple they seem. And yet people have really lost the skill set for interaction. Another thing, this isn't quite exactly how you frame the question, but so as I talk about civic belonging, there's a lot of elements of that support that and encourage that. One of them is the concept of third place. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Ray Oldenburg, I think, coined the term. And it's this idea that everyone needs a third place, a place between work and home that you can kind of stop in and check out. And he's thinking about like coffee shops or bars or whatnot, your kind of regular place where you show up and there's no agenda, that the regulars gather there. There's kind of an ongoing conversation that happens there. And one of the things he said that happens in the third place, where it was more common in our culture, is it has kind of a social training effect. If you're at a table with other people and you're exhibiting behavior that's less than ideal, that group's going to self-regulate it. They're going to move to another table. Someone might call you out, in that kind of setting. And you actually learn what's appropriate by having those kinds of interactions. And so, again, it's not necessarily something the church can solve on its own, but I think if we can encourage like third places in our community and places where people gather and whatnot, more opportunities for us to learn how to have normal conversations, how to be appropriate with the level of sharing that we do, how to, deal with sort of difficult political topics, or what kind of topics you should be a little bit careful, if you don't know someone super well. All that stuff doesn't get trained when we interact through screens. We can kind of, if we don't like somebody, we can unfriend them. We can, there's just so many, it's less likely that our edges are going to round it off.
I love that concept of third place. I absolutely see the truth of it because, a lot of times within our workplace or within our churches, that can't always be the place where we get honed. I know that iron's supposed to sharpen iron. I'm not talking about that, but I'm saying, it's we as leaders, right, don't want somebody going to small group and getting blasted out of the water because they're just socially awkward or something. And, we want them to feel that sense of belonging. But to open yourself up to go into a setting in which you can really observe socially what's going on and what's being received and how it's being received without the buffering of, well, in the workplace, we have to do it this way. In church, we have to do it this way. I think that's a really, really brilliant thing.
Another place where that, I'm sorry, Julie, to butt in there, but another place where this happens, and again, that doesn't solve the problem of the really chronically lonely person in your church, but the family dinner table is not a bad place for some of that training, because we're kind of trained as especially adult Christians in small groups, to be really polite, sometimes too polite to one another. Yeah. But the dinner table, you've got siblings that are just ruthless sometimes, and they, if it's well moderated, I love the idea. One of my teachers, Rich Mao, used to say, that we learn at the family dinner table to stay at the table with people we disagree with. Mm-hmm. And that's a lesson that is really valuable in the civic realm and in the church. And if we as parents are aware of that training component, we're training our kids to learn to be civic and civil, even when they really don't like the person sitting across the table from them. It's going to have all sorts of good impacts on them and our society. Yeah, that's a great way of looking at that third place. That's fantastic. Now, Eric, tell me, I think that one thing I'm seeing that's interesting that I think is relatively new, maybe not, but is this idea that work is somehow, the work environment is somehow almost supplanting our social lives, our family lives, our church lives, like the function of what has been family, socializing, faith community. People are wanting to find all of that in their work lives. And it's one thing I've watched people scramble with through the pandemic is they miss the physical environment of work. It's not that it's the task that they are employed for. It's all this, what we've been calling for a number of years now, sociologically, the work culture and all of that. Is there a place where we can lean in too heavily into our work environments to try to be all the things when it comes to resolving this sense of loneliness? Well, there's a lot of reasons why work has probably become increasingly important to our sense of identity and our sense of connection. And that is one, because we tend to be kind of a hardworking culture. Some of us get trapped in that sense of we earn our value by the things we produce at work. And that's a theological problem in some ways. But the other thing about work that I think kind of speaks more to my topic is work tends to be the kind of regular environment. In our workplace, we see people 5 days a week normally. One of the things that I kind of key in on my book is that friendship is important, but you can't program friendship, or it's very difficult to program. Sometimes people are like, oh, people are lonely. Okay, let's set them up with 3 friends. You, and you are going to call this person, and and that works okay. But it usually doesn't work because you just don't know who is going to connect and how are people going to connect. So friendship normally grows when there's proximity, frequency of contact, and kind of a shared experience. That's why college for a lot of people is where a lot of friendships are formed. You see people who live near you day and day and day and day over and over and over again. You form these friendships. Well, the workplace is one of the places outside of the home where that happens, where we see people over and over and over again. We have a shared project, and so we do tend to form a lot of friendships. And that's not altogether bad, but sometimes what's challenging about that is we also have a very transitory culture. And so those work families don't last forever.
Right.
And so people move on, you retire. And so I think work teaches us something about how friendships are formed, but I don't think we want to form all of our friendships with just work colleagues, because they're not usually going to endure the person who's transferred to another company or the person who retires. And so I think we need to replicate some of that regular, proximate, shared experience kind of connection with people outside of work as well.
How do I overcome the 3 pieces of glass that may be keeping me from the relationships I was really designed for? And I know this is a tricky question in the midst of also being, somewhat locked away, shut down, having to be very cautious about how we're handling physical presence with other people. But how do I conquer it? Because, for a lot of us, our work tasks are on that phone. And for a lot of us, the necessity of being in a vehicle, a certain set of time a day is just part of our daily lives. And when you get home and you're worn out from the peopling you've done, the television is often a go-to. How do we begin to obviously continue to have the presence of these 3 types of glass in our lives, but not allow them to be running us?
That's a great way of framing the question. And it's not easy to solve that. And in a lot of cases, we have to use the car. We like to use the TV, and the phone is really integral to the things we have to do. So I'm not suggesting we sort of throw any of those things away. But I do think that they become kind of habitual in a way. And I think we can maybe train ourselves to raise the question of, can I do this in a more face-to-face kind of way? For instance, the phone, yes, we accomplish a lot of things, but I even, as much as I really value and really talk about civic friendships, when I'm in the grocery store line and everyone else is, looking at their phone, I'll pull my phone out. And there's no reason I need to pull my phone out. I kind of go through I check my Instagram, check my Facebook, see if anyone needs blah, blah, blah. But I don't need to check it at that moment. So even just training myself to not pull my phone out and keep my face up, so that at least my face is available for some kind of eye contact with somebody, or some kind of, just to be aware of that. Or with the car, yes, we need to jump in the car and get there. But there may be ways that we can walk to certain destinations depending on where we live. And it's going to take a little bit longer, but the pro side is we're going to have some opportunities to connect with people. So for instance, in my community, like I mentioned, I live within a little over a half a mile from my church. So I always take my bike or I walk to church, and that is such a valuable experience for me. That's when I connect with my neighbors, and I show up to church feeling really connected to where I live. Some of our members live 30 minutes away, and they're not ever going to be able to walk to church. And I don't want them to move to my neighborhood. It's, there's a lot of reasons why they live where they live, and that's wonderful. But I've even suggested, and we've got a pretty good parking lot, but we do run a parking space sometime. And as our church grows, that becomes an issue. So one of the things I've been talking to my church about is, if you live 30 miles away, there's plenty of parking, like within a mile of our church. There's lots of neighborhoods with plenty of parking. Why don't you leave a little early, park half a mile away, and walk the last half a mile?
That's cool.
It's a little bit. So I think one of the traps we get into is we think efficiency is the most important value that trumps all other values. And efficiency often comes with a cost, a human cost. We can do this more efficiently, but we're going to take the person out of the equation. And so I guess what I'm suggesting is, keep in mind that, at the end of the day, one of the things we're built for is for human relationships. So don't always take the person out of that relationship. Always try to think, how can I reinsert the person into my daily task? I'm not just buying something at the store. I'm having an opportunity for interaction. So maybe I won't put my headphones in when I'm doing my shopping, so that I can be aware of the fact there's other people here that I might be able to connect with in one way or another.
I love that. The book is 3 Pieces of Glass, Why We Feel Lonely in a World Mediated by Screens. Eric, thanks so much for being with me today. Sure
Thanks,
appreciate
Julie.
you.
It's been a fun conversation.
Be sure and check out the show notes that our content coordinator, Rebecca, puts together each and every week. A big shout out to Donna. She is our producer and helps make sure that the audio quality and all the things are the way they need to be so that you can get the episodes. I would love to ask you a big favor. Would you do this for me? Would you go and subscribe and like the podcast wherever you get your podcasts? It really does help get the word out. And if you leave us a 5-star rating and a really sweet review, you might just get to hear your review read online here on the podcast. I would love to connect with you on all places social. You can find me, Julie Lyles Carr. I particularly love Instagram, so come see me over there. And while you're on the webs, be sure and check out AllMomDoes.com, which is our blog and website. It's an incredible resource for you. And of course, All Mom Does on the socials. And we also have the All Mom Does podcast discussion group where I check in and chat with you throughout the week about the episodes. So would love to see you there as well. I'll see you next time right here on the All Mom Does podcast.